So, what are the possible solutions to this crisis, and are there any new policies on the horizon? We turn now to Professor Alexander Betts of Oxford University's Refugee Studies Centre, and he has said that while Europe is squabbling, people are dying. Welcome back to the programme, Professor Betts.
Thank you.
So, if Chancellor Merkel says that this is the worst and the biggest test for Europe, far outweighing the Greek financial meltdown, why has there been no series of urgent meetings, no actual coherent laws and plans and policies?
It's absolutely scandalous that Europe's not treating this crisis with the urgency it deserves. I think part of the reason is it's over the summer, lots of people have been on holiday, but the priorities have been addressing austerity in Greece, addressing the challenges of relationships with Russia over Ukraine, and this has fallen to the bottom of the pile. Europe is showing itself to be uncaring about the lives of refugees, and people are dying here in Europe as a result of our political choices.
Do you agree that the political choices which have so far got nowhere in terms of a coherent plan is the biggest test for Europe? Is this as big an issue as Merkel says it is?
It's a massive challenge. Refugees and displacement will be one of the defining issues of the 21st century. It's a global challenge, and Europe is being parochial. It's seeing it as a regional issue rather than a global challenge, and states are engaging in unilateral policies. Hungary's trying to build a border fence. The UK is trying to renegotiate Schengen. What we need is collective action. We need it urgently, and we've got to stop infighting, and we've got to come up with a big political vision and a way of strategically negotiating that vision.
So what would you advise them? You study this. Oxford is leading the charge on studying this very timely issue. What would you advise them? Is it about reassessing Schengen? Is it about reassessing the whole asylum procedure?
We need a comprehensive refugee policy for Europe, and that has to be on at least two levels. Firstly, the global level, and secondly, a regional level. Globally, I think Europe's failing to recognise that it needs a policy to engage with the refugee issue on the wider global scale. There are 300,000 asylum seekers who have arrived in Europe this year. We have 28 member states in Europe. Compare that with 3.5 million refugees in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. Europe needs to engage in enhancing protection space where 95% of the world's refugees are. In other words, in the regions of origin, in countries that neighbour conflict and crisis. Secondly, we need a new deal on responsibility sharing within Europe. It's going to be difficult to achieve because countries that are proximate to refugee flows are in a difficult position, having to take the majority. Countries that are further away can hide behind water and territory and deny their responsibilities. But it's at those two levels that we've got to engage.
But what about, you've just mentioned the figures, just over 300,000 have come over this year alone. You said 28 pretty well-off countries are being asked to take their fair share. That's a pretty manageable number, isn't it? 300,000? It's not the hordes. It's not an overwhelming number of people.
With collective action, it should be manageable. Divide 300,000 by 28, and you get around 10,000 people per country. And yet the problem is that politicians are failing to take the moral courage and political leadership necessary to articulate to their populations and their electorates why we need burden sharing and responsibility sharing, why we have to do more, and who's coming from where and why. So it should be manageable, but to address it, we need a strategy. It's got to be global and it's got to be regional, and that requires leadership that is sorely lacking.
Now, tell our audience and tell these European leaders who insist that refugees are just a burden on our populations why you believe they're not necessarily a burden and that they actually can be a positive for economic development. Why should refugees be treated as a development issue, as you've said?
I think we've done research in Oxford where we've shown the economic benefits and contributions that refugees can make. They have skills, talents, aspirations. They're often entrepreneurial. And we see that in regions of origin. In countries that host many refugees, refugees often create businesses. They create jobs. And we see that here. They're ordinary people in exceptional circumstances. And what they can contribute is a response to our policies rather than the inherent value of these people who are human beings like you or I. In Uganda, for instance, in our research, we've been able to show that in a country where refugees have the right to work and freedom of movement, they create significant numbers of jobs for host nationals, for the Ugandan population, and that applies around the world.
Should we be concerned that our leaders are simply incapable or unwilling to come up with a coherent solution? Do you think they will? They're calling for a summit, you know, an emergency summit in 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks is a long time to wait.
There are some exceptional forms of leadership emerging in Europe. Germany is exceptional. But too often at the moment, we're seeing very cynical political messages where the signalling is to domestic electorates rather than with the aim of genuinely coming up with solutions. And I'm very concerned that Europe isn't taking this seriously enough to come up with credible solutions. If it's to do so, it needs to come up with a plan, and it needs that to be a realistic plan that all of Europe can buy into. Someone needs to spell out what's at stake. Lives are being lost, people are dying, we're part of a global challenge, and we need to situate Europe in that global world. That was what Europe was for.
And yet, let's be serious, a lot of this is about war and strife where these people are having to flee from. Let's take Syria, where for a while the majority of the refugees were coming from, and still are actually. This isn't going to end if the war in Syria isn't ended, and the European and US politicians show no sign at all of doing that.
We've got a failure to engage with fragile states. These people who are coming to Europe are coming from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia. Collectively, the world is bad at addressing state fragility. We need to engage with the root causes, but we also need to support the security and development challenges that exist in the host countries that neighbour those states. Most refugees are in those parts of the world, and unless we support them and their capacity to protect refugees, we'll see the kind of chaos and tragedy that we witness today in Europe.
What about a turning point, tipping point moment? You know, it seems that we've all become so inured to these crises, these devastating crises, murder, rape, plunder, pillage, drowning, dying in trucks, whatever's going on, ISIS, Syria, and all the rest of it. Will what happened this last week, the drowning off Libya, the suffocation in the trucks in Austria, do you think that will force a change? Will that be a turning point or not?
I think we've seen already far too much tragedy. I think there was a hope earlier in the year that the numbers of people drowning in the Mediterranean would bring change. Gradually, we see civil society mobilising. There's a push amongst Europe's population to suggest we need more humane policies that protect refugees, but equally on the other side, we see anti-immigration sentiment, xenophobia, and we need Europe's politicians to come to the fore, offer solutions and show leadership, to articulate to their publics why we have to protect refugees, make the ethical case, the legal case, show that refugees can offer economic and cultural contributions, but also articulate that unless we take refugees in Europe, other countries and other regions of the world, Lebanon, Jordan, Kenya, will stop doing so. And without reciprocity, the whole edifice of the global refugee regime is at risk.
And those countries you mentioned are saturated right now. Alexander Betts, thank you very much indeed.